good time seeing people share love on their fellow small group members, and so yeah, a lot of good people here that I enjoy connecting with. So good to see you guys. As Bryce said, we are concluding tonight our series called True Christianity. And what we've been attempting to do during this series is to tackle some of the biggest questions, some of the things that people may have misunderstandings or misconceptions about with regard to the foundations of the Christian faith. And so tonight we're tackling probably the biggest of them all, this question of if God is real and if God is good, then why is there so much suffering in the world? And I know this is a question that has really bothered a lot of people. I mean, I think back even on my own journey to faith, it certainly bothered me. To be honest, it still bothers me, all the suffering in the world. And you don't have to look far before you see a lot of brokenness and a lot of pain. I think about even just the reality that we're all living through right now with COVID. And here we are 6 months into this pandemic and spending hours and hours and even months of our lives on Zoom calls like this. And so just even things like that where there's just people that are suffering, people that are suffering in isolation with kind of mental illness and depression and things as a result of this. And so there's just a very real aspect to suffering, even in this current season of what we're living through. And of course, people who have lost their lives tragically due to COVID, not to mention the economic fallout. I think of even what we've also been walking through, and even the news today about Breonna Taylor, and just the suffering that the Black community is experiencing, and just the struggle for justice in our nation, and just reform of the justice system, and just all around this the complexity of the suffering even at times can feel overwhelming. And though there are a lot of things we might seek to address in any of these circumstances, and in trying to right wrongs and things like that, you certainly a very important question is the question of where does God fit into this? That if there is a good God, and we believe, as the scriptures say, I believe there is a good God. But if he is good and if he is all powerful, then why is there so much suffering in the world? And so we're going to attempt to get into that this evening. And I want to just say up front that really there are no easy answers. I think that what I'm going to be able to share over the next few minutes will bring some clarity, and I think it will be helpful. But really, there's nothing that I can say that's going to instantaneously just make everything better. That's certainly not the case. And so I want us to set our expectations really in the right place, is that I believe that unpacking some truth, it helps to orient us, it helps to give us perspective, and therefore it helps to give us hope and meaning. But you know, at the same time, nothing I'm going to say tonight is going to instantly heal everybody that is suffering with COVID, and it's not going to instantly end police brutality, or instantly end economic crises, or any of those things. And so I want to just set the expectations in that place tonight. But I believe that what I'm going to share is going to give you hope. It's going to help you to better understand the reality of what the scriptures teach about this, as Christians throughout 2,000 years have wrestled with this very important question. And so, just to get into it here tonight, we're going to look at a couple of verses. Firstly, Romans 3:23, and then secondly, Romans 6:23. And so these verses, if you're not familiar, they're both from what Christians call the New Testament. And Paul, one of the early Christian church leaders, was writing to a group of believers in the city of Rome, and he says a couple of things that are helpful in this topic. He says, firstly, in Romans 3:23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And so we need to understand tonight that, number one, suffering in the world is a result of the fall. Now, in that, as we've fallen short of the glory of God, and just to unpack that, if we went to Genesis chapter 2, we would see mankind's revolt, mankind's rebellion against God, where the world that God made originally, it was a beautiful world. It was perfect, not only beautiful, perfect. It was flawless. And it was really a result of man's disobedience and betrayal of God that upended this state of perfection and brought just this distortion into the world as we know it. And so we need to understand that suffering in the world is a result of the fall. It's a result of this shift of what took place so long ago, of mankind's rebellion against God and the distortion of creation that took place as a result. And that's important because, and by the way, not all suffering is caused directly by, people's actions. Some of it certainly is, that sometimes we bring suffering on ourselves, but not all of it is a direct effect. Some of it is just this sort of systemic brokenness of the world that we live in, caused by the fall. Secondly, looking at Romans 6:23, which says, "For the wages of sin is death." And and so again, death was not a part of God's original design in the earth. There was a tree of life in the center of the garden that was available for man to eat from. Death and suffering were a result of the separation that was caused because of sin between God and man. And as a result, humanity has been experiencing death and suffering ever since. And so again, this begs really the question that we're trying to dig into tonight is, okay, well, we understand now that there is suffering. We understand a little bit of, at least originally, where it came from. And by the way, we need to understand that it's real. Some different worldviews, some other religions would say that, hey, everything in this world is just an illusion, that it's not real. Well, I don't believe that is helpful, and neither is that accurate. That suffering is very real. It is not just an illusion, the suffering that we are witnessing in the world. No, it's very real. And so again, where's God in the midst of all of this? Well, we're going to move into that. And secondly, here though, I want to look at this original design that God had in Genesis 1, verse 27 through 28. And also in verse 31, it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. And God said, 'Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth.' And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." And so, again, as I said earlier, the world as God made it was originally very good. Um, so to that question of why doesn't God do something about this? Well, very important. We need to understand that actually, when we ask that question of, hey, why doesn't God do something about this? Where is God? Why doesn't He intervene? Well, I want to say very clearly that God did do something about it. And so when we ask, why doesn't God do something about it? We need to do is we need to understand that actually God grieves with us, that he sees the brokenness. He sees just the devastation of this beautiful world that he created, and his heart breaks with our hearts. In fact, I believe it breaks his heart even more than it breaks our heart, because he has a greater perspective on how it actually is supposed to be. We've been living in a broken world our whole lives. We've witnessed countless tragedies, both personally as well as just through the internet and the news. Just we're overwhelmed every single day with tragedy. And so for us, even though we are rocked by it at various points, in a way, it can almost start to feel normal to us. But yet, God sees it even more clearly, and his heart breaks because he knows how he ordered this in the first place. He knows how this piece of art, and there was someone in my smaller group earlier as we were discussing who's an artist. I know we've got some art students here in ENC, and there's something about the artist that has a unique perspective on their art. They know they see a vision for how it's supposed to be. And the person that just comes along and sees it from the outside perspective may be like, "Oh, that's cool," or "Oh, I see this." But frequently, the passerby doesn't notice all the detail or doesn't understand the vision quite in the same way that the designer actually does. And so similarly, God saw this world in his heart before he even created it, and therefore he grieves deeply over the brokenness of his creation. And he stepped in. He didn't just stay distant and say, "Oh, well, let me just, scrap this world and move on." No, he intervened. He took on human flesh in the form of Jesus Christ, and he entered into his creation. He entered into this work of art that he had created. And he did so engaging in suffering himself in order to redeem us and free us from suffering. And so this is my third point, is that Jesus suffered for us in order to redeem us and free us from suffering. We see very plainly in John chapter 3 verse 16. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." And so elsewhere, we see, for example, in Philippians chapter 2, where it says very plainly that Jesus humbled himself. And so he entered in and taking on the form of a servant, even unto death on a cross. And so this thing that you no doubt have heard about of Jesus dying on a cross, we need to understand that this was a significant, in fact, the most significant moment in all of history when it comes to God seeking to enter in and seeking to bring about actions that would ultimately bring about healing and an end to suffering. And so we see a God who embraced suffering in his own self so that we ultimately one day could be freed from suffering. Jesus left the comforts of heaven to come down to earth during a incredibly harsh time. I mean, hey, let's be honest. The first century in the ancient Near East, it was a brutal place. The Roman authorities, they were not doing any favors for these Hebrews. They were not looking to make life easy. No, they were very heavy-handed in their ruling. And so Jesus experienced that. He experienced harsh treatment from rulers. He experienced growing up and just a difficult situation. Even though he had a loving mother, we have good reason to believe that Joseph, his stepfather, wasn't around the whole time, because he's not mentioned later on in Jesus's life. That probably Joseph passed away. And so some of you here, maybe you've lost a parent along the way. I believe Jesus can relate to you. He understands what that's like. Jesus was betrayed by some of his closest friends. He felt that sting. He knows what it's like to be misunderstood. And so many of the things that we experience and the pain, Jesus, even himself, can directly relate to us because he himself endured suffering. Ultimately, as we know, even this brutal death on the cross. We know a lot about Roman crucifixion from history, and this is one of the most excruciating and painful ways to die. And in Jesus' case, he experienced really a a just double amount of hardship, because he was whipped before he was crucified, which was uncommon, because crucifixion itself was such a brutal thing. And in fact, we see this even with Jesus on the cross. And if you're familiar with the story, he had two other criminals that were next to him on the cross, and and Jesus was the first to die. Why? Because he had endured so much up to that point, that unlike many times crucifixion would drag on for days, and the person there would struggle to breathe, and they would just slowly kind of bleed and just be humiliated, and then they would asphyxiate. They would have so much trouble breathing that they would ultimately expire. But Jesus suffered, so he suffered all that, and he did it with purpose. He did it so that you and I could be freed from suffering. Guys, as we talk about suffering, I want to just share a personal testimony with you. I've certainly gone through suffering in my life, and I just want to share a testimony, because I believe that God's desire is to meet us in a place of suffering, and sometimes that leads to a miracle in the moment through His grace. Other times that does not happen instantaneously, But I've got a experience. I've had an experience with my daughter that I want to share with you guys. That it's really been one of the greatest miracles I've experienced in my life, and was one of the biggest moments where I've really just um, been suffering, been struggling, not because of my own self, but uh, just because of my daughter. When my daughter was born, she uh, was expected to be a perfectly healthy child, but very quickly after she was born, within the first couple of minutes, it became obvious that she wasn't breathing properly. And so the doctors who were delivering her kind of rushed her to the next room, and they put an oxygen mask on her, and they tried to just see what was going on and assess her. And over the course of the next couple hours, unfortunately, it wasn't getting better. It was getting worse. I stayed with her at the hospital that she was transferred to that day. I was there till late in the night, went back to the original hospital where my wife was recovering from a C-section, and then woke up the next morning, first thing, called over to the other hospital, and they said, "Hey, it's been a crazy night since you left. She's crashed a couple times. She has not been doing well." And so I was just kind of in shock of, wow, this has just gone from bad to worse, and rushed over to the other hospital, and uh, got there more or less in time for them to make a decision to load her onto a medical helicopter and fly her to yet another hospital, a third hospital that was several hours away from us. And so I'm on the roof of this hospital watching them load my 2-day old baby girl into a medical helicopter and taking off. And it was a surreal experience. And then just the ensuing events that happened of my wife and I kind of racing down there, and her trying to get released quickly from the hospital, getting down there. And it was just a crazy time. I'm going to show you guys just a couple of pictures here, actually, from what we experienced in that time. And so let me go to the screen share here. If this is going to work for us. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, here we go. So this is my daughter Maddie when she was at this third hospital, and you can see a lot of the different wires and things coming off of her, and actually they they ended up putting a whole lot more wires and various things on her. And anyway, to make a long story short, her lungs weren't working properly, and she wasn't able to convert the oxygen that's in the air into oxygen in the blood, which is a huge problem because we need oxygen in our blood in order for our bodies to function properly. And so it was a scary situation, and we were just praying every day and saying, God, would you help? Even as we're honestly just in a state of shock. We're living away from home in this in this place called the Ronald McDonald House, which is a nonprofit that helps families of kids that are in the hospital. And it was just a crazy time. But and I jumped forward to the next picture, guys, just to see. This is my daughter a couple years ago, and there's a photo of her from just for a few days ago, a couple days ago. And so I share that, guys, just to say, the Lord really met us in that time, in a time that was extremely confusing, in a time when we didn't even know if my daughter was going to live. We didn't know if she was going to have permanent brain damage from not enough oxygen. It was such a scary time, and such a just a surreal and bewildering time. Um, and and yet the Lord really met us. He really helped. He met us in our suffering. I'm going to go ahead and end the screen share. And so I share that just as a testimony of God's faithfulness, of how I believe God met us, and He met my daughter in her suffering. He met my wife and I as we were suffering, and I believe He healed her. Honestly, the doctors have even said as much as say, "Hey, this is a miracle. This is just not normal." And so just to give thanks to God for His help. Now, I will also say one of the things that we have also wrestled with in regards to suffering is that some of the other families that we got to know while we were there, their children didn't make it in some cases, and so we've really wrestled with that and said, God, what do we make of this? And God, why did our daughter make it and others didn't? And guys, that's still somewhat of a struggle. We don't have all the answers to that. But what we have come to see is that uh, God desires to meet us in our sufferings. And in some moments, that will be an instantaneous or kind of a near term blessing or release. But beyond what happens in the near term, according to what we've seen here, is that Jesus made a way that ultimately all sin and all death will be addressed. That regardless of what happens here in the next few years of our lives or even our lifetime here on earth, that God made a way that eternally all things that are wrong can be made right and all suffering can be alleviated through Jesus Christ. Which leads me to the fourth and final point this evening is that God promises that one day he will restore creation and put suffering to an end. We read in the book of Revelation, this person was seeing a vision and of what was going to come in the end times. And he says this, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. I love that picture that's there. And again, what's significant is that this isn't just a poetic description of what would be nice. This is a vision of what God is, in fact, going to do, that he will right the wrongs, he will restore his creation, he will wipe away every tear from the eyes of those who have mourned and suffered. And so, because of this, we can have tremendous hope. We can have tremendous anticipation of what God is going to do. This God who did not just stay distant, who did not just dismiss his creation or destroy his creation without mercy, but instead, no, he drew near. He, in fact, even entered into his creation in order to embrace suffering himself and to make a way that we could be freed from pain and from suffering if we would put our trust in him, if we would put our hope in Jesus. And so tonight, as I attempt to address this rather weighty topic, uh, I hope that you're encouraged. I hope this gives hope to you. And I want to share in conclusion this quote from someone named Timothy Keller. He writes in his book titled The Reason for God, in which he addresses a lot of topics like this that can be challenging for us to understand. He says, though Christianity does not provide the reason for each experience of pain, it provides deep resources for actually facing suffering with hope and courage rather than bitterness and despair. And so I believe that as we look to Jesus, as we understand the provision that God has made ultimately to free us from suffering, we're able to endure suffering when we must. Now, I don't advocate just seeking out suffering. Life will bring you suffering. If you have not experienced suffering, I'm sure that you will, though I certainly would never wish that upon you. And when that comes, my hope for you is that you would be able to endure suffering, that you would be able to walk through suffering with hope and with courage instead of growing bitter and falling into despair. And so, friends, I hope that encourages you. I hope that helps you this evening. We're going to go into a time of Q&A